Hey everyone, Flo from Lens here, and today we're doing another cinematography breakdown. So this time I want to discuss my latest short documentary, The Feeling of Freedom. If you haven't watched it, I suggest you do it now and come back to this video later. It's just 6 minutes long. And by the way, thank you so much for the positive feedback, it really means a lot to me. So we'll talk about the way that I shot it, the gear that I used, and more specifically the different sports we had to cover and the different setups that I used. Before I start, don't forget to subscribe to see more videos like this one, and let's get into it. This video is sponsored by FilmConvert. As always, here's a brief background of why this documentary happened in the first place. As you know, I sell footage online, and originally what I wanted to do is just shoot a bunch of clips of my sister doing different activities to be used for footage licensing only, so cycling, running, paragliding, etc. But the more we discussed the idea, the more I was like, okay, maybe we can actually shoot a spec ad. That way I can use it for portfolio and my sister can also use it to get sponsors or anything like that. And then again, the more we talked about it, the more we realized that we could actually turn this into a short documentary instead. That way I could still use the footage for footage licensing, I could still use it for portfolio, and I also had something to share with you guys here on YouTube. This is something that was decided very close to the actual shoot. We shot the whole thing over 2 days and we cancelled twice due to bad weather the first time and scheduling conflicts for the second time. In terms of gear, I used a 6K Pro. I knew that I would be shooting by myself and that I would have to run, hike, cycle, so I didn't want a big rig at all. I wanted something very minimal, so the 6K Pro was perfect for that. I did use a gimbal for half the shoot, which is quite rare for me, and I will talk about this in a bit. With lenses, I mostly use the Canon zoom lenses, my Sigma 18-35 and the Meiki 25mm. And I also use the Osmo Action for the paragliding sequences. The main idea behind this whole shoot was also to get coverage for footage licensing, so I was shooting wides, close-ups, and also different pacing and energy when I could. I actually shot around 300 clips, but I used only roughly 30% in the final edit, and I shot everything in 6K B-RAW, 12:1, all handheld. Okay, now let's get into the actual breakdown. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pick frames for the main sequences instead of playing the video in real time. Okay, so we're now in DaVinci and this first shot was shot just after sunset. This is the opening. I used the Meiki 25mm and I really wanted to have that silhouette look. So I exposed for the highlights that you can see here and the rest fell into darkness. I shot pretty wide for this one, obviously with the lens, so I was stepping back and the whole thing was shot at ISO 400. I don't think I needed to go higher than that. I wanted to get a nice close-ups as well with the Meiki, that's why I used this lens for these frames for example, just because the Meiki has quite a lot of character and it worked really well for this. I shot a bit of slow motion as well, as you saw in the footage, just to get rid of the micro jitters because this lens is not stabilized. We were also at 2300 meters high. It was getting quite cold and the light was disappearing quite quickly. I got my sister to do the same action 2 or 3 times. So basically walking along this ridge here, back and forth, to walk there, to sit, to look, etc. Then I would either follow her or I would just find a spot that I was happy with in terms of composition. The whole idea for this blue hour sequence was to show being in the mountains and just to reflect and find peace. So I kind of knew as I was shooting this that this would be the opening sequence. Now let's get into the next shot, which is this one. So this is one of my favorite shots. I used the Canon 70-200 for this one because I wanted a compressed look. So I was actually kneeling down and I waited for her to enter the frame. I shot in slow motion again to reduce the shakes since I didn't have a tripod, and I make sure to keep the mountains in frames. Here obviously I had my guidelines on the actual 6K Pro monitor. I knew that I would use that aspect ratio. And I was also trying to show a bit of the ground just to have some kind of like line and a sense of like space and a distance between her and the mountains behind. For this documentary, I actually used the 70-200 for compression or close-up details instead of using it purely for its range. So next we've got this sunny lake. Even though it looks super bright, this was actually only 9 AM. I think the light was extremely harsh. As you can see on her arms here and here, the sun was just roughly around here, camera right, just behind us, And I shot this with the Canon 16-35 on the gimbal and the same, the Crane 2S, the giant. I love the reflection of the lake here, and I kind of wanted her to stay centered. Again, for footage licensing, I just wanted to keep things safe. In his documentary, I always try to always have some sort of movement. So even for this shot, for example, I was panning left to right, back and forth. Either she was moving or I was moving if she wasn't. She did have a few t-shirt options, but I prefer the pink against the blue here and the green. It's funny, like clothing actually can play a pretty big part in terms of filmmaking, and especially in documentary. So when she asked me what do you want me to wear, I said go for the brightest color, and for other situations when we had more color, I was choosing the other option. Now let's go to the next one. So this one, the ridge. This shot is actually the one that I had first in mind when we discussed this idea to make something, just because I know the spot very well. Again, I shot this one on a 16-35, both in slow motion and real time. Again, I did this throughout the whole shoot to give myself options in edit and in also for footage licensing. As you can see, the sun is just here sitting behind a mountain, and you've got this like beautiful rays. I exposed for the highlights, and this was really bright, but I was happy because I wanted that kind of contrast here. I wanted that silhouette look, that detached look, which I think looks pretty cool. I like that her hair was actually catching. Also, if you see in the video, the light, you can see here on the back of her slightly, but when you watch the video you can really see the light hitting her back again and again, and it looks really nice to me. In terms of composition, I obviously focus on the ridge here that I was showing before, but I also try to get a 1/3 kind of 2/3 ratio, so you can see here and here it's pretty even in terms of this part and this part, and I tried to do this in here as well, like that, so you can see kind of like leading lines. I tried to use those shots when she was either entering the frame or leaving the frame, again just to show movement. The funny thing is, so we got there a bit later than expected, and I thought we'd have more time, so we only had about 15 minutes to shoot this, so I got her to run twice back and forth, but this shot is actually the reverse shot of this. In the edit you don't really realize, but the rays, like these mountains for example, are actually these ones. So I wanted to have that kind of like continuity in terms of movement left to right. So this shot is actually her coming back but in reverse, and shot at the exact same time. Next, we're gonna go to the cycling shot. So I think this is a part that I got asked the most about. So this was my setup. Since I was by myself, the only way I could film her riding apart from shooting from far away was to actually ride next to her with a gimbal. I used the 16-35 again and the Crane 2S. It was quite heavy and also quite hard to ride my bike with one hand, especially because I've got a road bike, like a gravel bike. So to change gears was very hard, and sometimes I just couldn't. What I would do, I would actually set up the gimbal on the ground, then I would jump on the bike and my sister would give me the rig. So I basically had 3 ways of shooting, and let me use the older pocket to illustrate what I mean. I've got my little setup here. So to follow her for a shot like this one, or to be next to her, I would hold the gimbal at eye level. So basically I was riding with my left hand and holding the gimbal like this close to my shoulder, so it was actually stable, and I kind of knew that it was roughly at my head level, and I could sometimes kind of like have a look at the screen, and it worked really well. To get close-ups of her shoes, for example, or the pedal, I was holding it underslung like you saw in a photo, so like this, and I was actually easier in terms of weight because obviously gravity pulls everything down, so I could ride better like this. The problem, it was very hard for me to look in front of me as well as down at the same time. But the screen of the Pocket Pro actually came in very handy in that situation. I could kind of like peek down and just have a look, and if it was kind of roughly in focus or not. The hardest part was to film her coming at us, so front on. To do this, I had to hold a gimbal like this. So I was actually holding the gimbal past my shoulder, looking back, and basically I couldn't see what I was filming at all. We had to do 4 or 5 tries for each of the shots, and sometimes she would tell me, oh, I think it's pointing down or it's pointing up. We rode on a path that has no cars whatsoever, only cyclists and pedestrians, so it was a lot easier. I think all in all, we shot for 3 hours and I was absolutely exhausted by the end. It was 30 degrees as well. The 6K Pro helped a lot. The Giant, the Crane 2S did really well. Again, I shot a mix of slow-mo, a mix of normal speed, but sometimes I knew that I would need shots that would show the speed. There's a sequence that I knew I would need to shoot in real time. And to show how fast we were going or how fast she was going in terms of exercising. So we were riding at around 25 kilometers an hour. I was actually shooting as wide open as I could, so f4, 5.6, to make sure that I would get some blur in the background to increase the effect of speed, which made it harder to focus because, as you can imagine, there's no autofocus. This is when I miss it. And I considered using my EOS R for that, but once I knew that I could use a gimbal and it might work, I was like, no, I want to use the 6K Pro. But that's when I miss autofocus, and I had to always make sure, especially at f4, that I was in range. So to be able to ride with one hand and to make sure that I would keep the same distance all the time at 25 kilometers an hour, it's quite hard. Some of the shots sometimes didn't work. Sometimes I even pressed the wrong button. I remember doing the underslung and pressing the wrong button and the camera actually turned around to me instead of her. Composition was very hard on this sequence. I think I just played it safe. So apart from adjusting the focal length, I did my best to keep things in frame. I think it worked out pretty well considering the sketchy setup and the harsh light. As you can see here on her face, there's quite of, you can see the line here is hitting her quite hard, but I didn't really mind it because it looked real, and again I was shooting for footage licensing as well, so I wanted things to look kind of natural, but I did my best to get a mix of shots and light. All in all, I was quite happy with it. And now a quick word about today's sponsor, FilmConvert. As most of my work, this whole short documentary was graded using FilmConvert. I've talked about it before on the channel many times, but FilmConvert enables you to add film color and grain to your videos. So there are nearly 20 film stock to choose from, and you have real film grain, which gives you an authentic and organic look. For this one, I actually used quite a lot of grain. I didn't want a super clean and sharp look, so I was very happy with the results. Pretty much all my travel and documentary work is graded using FilmConvert, and I have been using it for nearly 8 years. I recently made a dedicated video where I discuss my color grading process, so feel free to watch it, and don't forget to check out the link in the description to save 10% off. Next is paragliding. This one was very tricky to organize as I needed to shoot her taking off in the sky as well, and we decided not to film the landing because I couldn't make it back in time at the bottom of the mountain. For the first session I focused on the getting ready parts, as you can see here. This one I shot everything on a 16-35 again, and I tried to shoot backlit as much as possible, so the sun was roughly here. It was very harsh in terms of light, but the sky was actually overcast, as you can see behind her here, so it actually worked out okay, and the shadows, like the light wasn't that hard on her. We had to rush though because the wind was getting stronger, and in terms of framing, most of the time I kept her in the center, again just to be safe, but I did get some close-up details as you saw in the video, and I always make sure to try to keep the mountains here to find some interesting line, as you can see here. So always trying to find something in the background to increase the depth as much as possible. Like I said, I got quite a lot of detailed shots, but for this sequence we only had about 15 minutes because she actually had to get ready, and so I was trying to basically film everything that I could. You can see here, so even though the light is hitting her here, I didn't have a reflector, I didn't have anything, I was just shooting with a lens, I didn't have like matte box, I just used the internal filters. Her face actually had some sort of like a soft look to it, and again wardrobe. So for example, this jacket, this orange jacket here, works really well against the green of the grass, the blue of the sky, and we actually did some wardrobe tests in the backyard just before to have an idea what it would look like. Taking off, this shot was very stressful. So in terms of composition, you can see I was keeping her centered again. You've got this line actually leading to her. and again keeping the mountains in the background as well. I wanted to play it safe, to make sure that I wouldn't miss, because I only had one shot. I was just by myself, so I filmed wide, I stayed stable, didn't do anything fancy, and also because of my sister, I was kind of like, I was hoping that everything would turn out okay. It's quite impressive to film paragliding, but when it's someone that you actually like care about, like someone of your family, it's a different experience as well. So I stayed there and it was fine. For the flying section, as I was saying, I did use the Osmo. What she did was actually having it around her neck on a small Peak Design strap, I think, just because obviously she needs her hands to fly. So I said to her, film if you can only, but if you can, try to film a few seconds of your feet, try to film yourself if you can, and also try to film the sail. She actually did a pretty great job, and even added some few angles that I ended up using. Then for me, my job was to film her also flying over me. So on this shot, for example, so this was shot on the second day. So the first day I just did the getting ready part, and the second day I decided to drive down to the middle of the mountains to kind of get a spot where I knew that she would be flying over. I shot this on a 70-200 handheld as well. It was hard to expose because the clouds, as you can see, were super bright, and I was also looking up, like as up as you can look, so it was very hard to get stable shots. So again, I shot a mix of slow motion and normal speed, and in terms of aperture, I actually shot everything at f16 or f22, which I never do, but I wanted to make sure that everything was in focus. I only had like 3 or 4 minutes. In terms of composition, again, this is a documentary, so with documentaries I always think about trying to find good angles when I can, especially like for example at blue hours or at sunset. You know, I try to find the good lights, to find the silhouette and what looks impressive visually. But for something like this, you work on instinct, and I just have to get whatever I can get. But I was still, you know, trying to find here again 1/3, 2/3, keeping her in the centered. I was lucky that I had that kind of like blue path in the middle here, worked out really well. My main goal here at the time was to show that you have freedom up there to link up obviously to the whole idea. But this time, this was on the second day. This is one of the last things that we shot. I kind of knew what I wanted in terms of like on the outcome of this documentary and the feeling of it. Okay, now I want to touch as well on the interview, because obviously the voiceover is a big part of this documentary. So we sat down in my living room. I'm going to show you the setup, very basic setup now. And I asked my sister a bunch of questions, roughly around 10. I did send them to her before, so she had the idea what I was looking for. It took around 25 minutes to record the whole thing, and we did it in one go. Originally, I didn't think the video would be longer than 3 minutes, but I wanted short answers so that they would be easily cut. Again, this was at the start intended to be footage licensing as well as a spec ad, so I didn't need a whole bunch of like words and long sentences, but that worked out really well. In terms of gear for the interview, I just used my Rode mic, the Rode Video Mic Pro, I think it's called, and I put that on a small iFootage tripod, tabletop tripod, and I plugged it straight into my MacBook Pro. And I think obviously we live in a house, so it's quite quiet, but I think it worked out okay. I did have 2 sound panels in front just to kind of absorb any sort of like sound. I don't know if that helped, but I was quite pleased. And my sister was also very good in interview in a way that I've done heaps of interviews like over the past like 8 or 10 years, but she never repeated herself once. She never said or like we say in French. So that's something that's really good. Sometimes when you've got someone that's comfortable or that has a nice way of speaking, it really helps, because it can be quite stressful for both the filmmaker and the person if the person is not comfortable in front of the camera. I always like when I do cinematography breakdown like this to talk about if I had to do this again. If I had to shoot this again, I would definitely add another day to be able to capture more content in better light maybe. A lot of the shots were shot in harsh light, which is not always ideal, but again, this is a documentary, and I wanted to have a wide variety of footage anyway, but I also wanted to capture more dynamic content. I think it would have been better, and I've asked a few people for feedback, and they said, it would have been great to have a bit more change in pace. And it's true, I agree, but I just didn't have time to capture what I could over 2 days, and by myself, as you can imagine, if you're a solo filmmaker, I got everything that I could, and that's the best that I could do, and I'm still really happy with it. I really love that piece, but I would have liked to film her in the city as well. When she talks about the difference between living in a city and in the countryside or in the mountains, I would have liked to film her in the city with all the noise and things. I think that would have really added a bit of contrast. And so the reason the story is a bit limited, a bit linear in terms of conflict or arc, again, is because I was shooting sequences and not a story. That's it for me for today, guys. Hopefully you've enjoyed this cinematography breakdown. Let me know if you have any more questions. I tried to kind of like summarize the whole shoot here. But as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye. Also, feel free to check out my new ebook, Freelance Documentary Filmmaking, An Introduction, where you can find a streamlined but comprehensive overview from pre-production all the way to marketing, built on years of my own experience shooting short documentaries around the world.